A very big hello from the Prestige Golf Shire right here in Bangalore, and welcome to Tea Time today with me, Chetty Narula. Now, it is said that surround yourself with influence people and people who are doing well, and that's when you end up doing well in your career. Today on the show, I have the young managing director called Ravindra Pai, who is the managing director of Century Real Estate. Of course, he was surrounded by his father in his early days of his career, who is a visionary and an institution in himself, Dr. Dayanand Pai, who founded Century Real Estate, one of the premier real estate companies right here in Bangalore.
On the show this week, we have Ravindra Pai, MD of Century Real Estate Holdings.
Priced right, and your ticket sizes are right, sales are extremely good. But I think where most real estate companies are struggling is at the capital structure level.
In news, Graham McDowell beats Webb Simpson in playoff at RBC Heritage. And Himmat Rai finishes tied 19th in Solaire Open in Manila.
Ravindra, thank you so much for joining me today on Tea Time. Such a beautiful city of gardens, Bangalore, and indeed a fabulous 18-hole golf courses where we're standing today.
Oh, it really is. I think the strength of Bangalore has been the great weather that we enjoy right through the year. And even if it's the middle of summer, it's still, I think, a great day for an enjoyable game of golf.
Sports is something that runs into your family. When did you take on to golf?
I took on to golf about 10 years back. I was prompted to pick the game primarily because of the club membership. The club memberships in Bangalore mandate you to play a certain number of rounds before you're selected as a member.
Right.
So I purely started the game only to get my membership. And then I think as I started playing the game, I started to enjoy the game. And ever since I've been playing, of course not as much as I would have loved to more recently. But for about 10 years, I've been playing the game now.
Your father, Dr. Dayanand Pai, he's an institution in himself, and he was the one who founded Century Real Estate. Has he mentored you?
As in any business family,
yeah.
You have business conversations over dinner. You observe him, you watch him meet people, and I think a lot of this gets internalized as you sort of grow up. I think from that perspective, definitely he's been a mentor, a guide, a role model, somebody to look up to.
So entrepreneurship is really something that runs in your blood, isn't it?
I would think so. My grandfather was an entrepreneur, although on a much smaller scale in a city called Mangalore, which is a small town a few hours away from Bangalore. And Dad, of course, the first generation entrepreneur who's came into Bangalore and has created this whole wonderful empire around real estate. I would like to believe I'm an entrepreneur in spirit, although I of course had the backup or the backing or of a wonderful platform that Dad had created.
Right.
But I think the whole journey of building the development platform,
of course,
has
sustaining it is also a challenge in itself, which you are doing today.
Absolutely, I think that's been a very enjoyable journey, and
it's not like you graduated from B school and you joined as the managing director of this company. You've had your own entire career that you mapped out for yourself. You worked under different organizations. What was the journey like to being the managing director of a premier real estate company today?
I think the journey has been fantastic, and my work experience, so after my engineering, I worked for 2 years with Tata Infotech as a programmer.
Exactly what I'm saying. So
after which
you built it for yourself.
Yeah. So after which I joined IIM Bangalore to do my MBA. That I would think was a fantastic experience. IIM as you know, is a microcosm of the whole world.
Absolutely.
In a small community, you find, competition. You find politics. You find everything that you sort of find in the world outside. And that experience has been very good. After which I joined Oracle. I was handling sales for them for South and West. And Oracle being an extremely aggressive sales-driven organization. I learned a lot. As I was growing up, it was always drilled into our head that we have to come back to the family business.
Right.
So I think that was kind of given. But I thought I bought some time for myself to sort of work with some of these large organizations that I just talked about. Just to get the experience of how a large organization works, the processes, the scale. So from that, moving into a family business, which is in real estate especially, which is sort of unorganized, unstructured,
very fragmented,
and especially the time when I joined, 2003-4. I mean, today, I think the industry has matured a lot more than what it was when I started. But back then, it was in completely unorganized industry. Real estate was considered a bad word. And, coming from a professional sort of a background into this sort of an environment wasn't easy. So I think it had its set of challenges. Looking back, I think I think we've done fairly well for ourselves where we are today.
Absolutely. So on that note, time now for us to tee off and talk a little more in detail about Century Real Estate, for which we're here to talk about. Come. Forward-thinking outlook exuded by your father back in 1973 when he bought land for about 5 rupees per square feet, and today that same land costs about 20,000 rupees per square feet. Would you be able to put some figures in place what you plan to do today with that kind of a vision?
Well, like you rightly mentioned, I think Dad has been a pioneer in the real estate sector in Bangalore. And I mean, back when in 1973, real estate was not even considered an industry. It's only in the last maybe a decade or so that people talk about real estate as a recognizable industry. And for him to sort of with very little capital to have sort of made this a career decision, I think is a fairly bold decision in itself.
When you say very little capital in the sense?
So he's a first generation entrepreneur, right? And he lost his father very early on. He came to Bangalore in the early 70s. He was employed with a contracting company, and he just believed so much that in this field, that he decided that he wanted to do this full time. Gave up his job, started just buying land, and rest, as they say, is history.
Absolutely. Today he stands on an empire.
So today, I think the good fortune for us is that we are blessed with a tremendous platform, right? I mean, we have over 3,000 acres of land in and around Bangalore, extremely strategic locations. So that's been one of our strengths. I mean, the reason we've been so successful is that our quality of land bank is extremely prime. We've bought land at historical costs, unlike most developers who possibly sort of jumped into the game more recently.
Yeah.
So these are our obvious strengths, and I think for us the challenge is really how do we sort of capitalize on this sort of platform. Right. How do we monetize the land as quickly as possible?
Right.
And which is what we've been going about doing in a systematic manner. So for the first about 5 years of our development avatar, we were very focused on residential developments. So we wanted to do purely apartments and villa complexes. We did some joint ventures, and in the past we've done many joint developments with many reputed builders in Bangalore. Over 20 million square feet of joint developments with all the reputed names in Bangalore.
Right.
But somehow we felt that the joint development model was not necessarily landowner friendly. At least back then it wasn't. And I think everybody was really going through a learning curve back then.
Yes.
And so that's how we started the development platform. And our challenge today is how do we monetize this large land bank as early as possible.
Okay, hitting brass tacks now with real estate. Now in the year gone by, that is 2012, we saw investor sentiment be very subdued in the market. But at the same time, the home prices saw an uptick. What is your outlook for 2013?
I think 2013 is starting on a good note. I'm very optimistic that 2013 will be a good year for the sector. Like you rightly mentioned, I think the last maybe couple of years have been extremely challenging. From an investor standpoint, even from a real estate, from a capital raise perspective. Primarily, I think because a lot of money has been invested in the 2006-07 sort of a boom, and many of the investors have not got an exit. So that has sort of created a subdued sort of sentiment for investors. And you're right, there is a bit of a dichotomy that home prices are going up, but real estate companies are still struggling.
Yeah.
And in fact, even the sales are very good. And I mean, it's a very strange scenario that sales are extremely good, and you're still struggling for cash in that sense. So I think there are two real distinct issues that are there. One is from the consumption side. I think that story is very robust. I think the India story is very intact in that sense. I mean, demand is very high.
It is a consumption-led market anyway.
Absolutely. So I think if it's priced right, and your ticket sizes are right, sales are extremely good. But I think where most real estate companies are struggling is at the capital structure level, because opportunities to raise fund or the sources of funds have become very, very scarce. So they were private equity, but most of them are now moved to high cost debt. Banks are very wary to lend real estate, to lend to the real estate sector. So I think most companies are sort of caught in this dichotomy of, struggle at the capital structure level, but at the same time having a fairly good operational sort of results going on.
Interesting. On that note, we're going to take a quick break right here on Tea Time. We're in conversation with the Managing Director of Century Real Estate, and of course, a bird's eye view of the real estate sector follows on the other side of this break. Stay tuned to Tea Time. still tuned into Tea Time with me, Chaiti Narula. We're in conversation with the Managing Director of Century Real Estate, Ravindra Pai. Ravi, we were discussing earlier about the industry and the kind of duress it is in at the moment and the challenging times that the real estate sector is facing. Despite that, we're seeing an uptick in pricing of residential real estate as well. Now, what is triggering this trend in your opinion?
I think primarily, the input costs are rising, and the financing costs are high, as we just talked about, and debt being very, very expensive.
Correct.
So I think builders really don't have too much choice but to raise prices. Although I would say that it's fairly moderated rise in maybe certain micro markets. There is a large increase in pricing, but primarily it is. I think it's still an affordable market, and it is still a buyer's market in my view.
Now, having established that the industry remains fragmented and unorganized in many ways, then one, of course, things are improving at the moment. A lot of regional players are also aspiring to make pan-India presence felt. What are your plans around that?
See, honestly, we've always believed that real estate is a very regional business. And even in the times, of 2007-8, when everybody was going pan-India, and investors were asking developers, for a pan-India footprint. We fortunately resisted from doing so. I think this really lends itself to our sort of pedigree in real estate, that we understand the sector so deeply and so well. Many other players have ventured into other cities, but I don't think the experience has been very good. Even many of the larger players, for example, a DLF, purchased a piece of land in Bombay, only to exit, very recently. Correct. So I think it's today everybody's reconciled to the fact that this is a regional business. You have your home turf where your strengths are, and you need to focus on that. So we find a lot of opportunities in Bangalore that we really don't need to explore or venture beyond Bangalore. So we have aggressive plans, but in Bangalore.
Now, the drivers in this sector is rapid urbanization, expanding city limits, and are you planning to tap into those kind of areas as well?
Real estate in Bangalore, whether we like it or not, is very dependent on the IT sector.
Absolutely.
Be it the commercial offtake, be it the derived sort of residential sales, linked to the IT sector and people from the IT sector buying it. So what we do is, we conceive projects which are more sort of tech oriented. We try to create niche sort of products which are targeted very specifically to the IT sector. I'm talking about IT sector because for Bangalore that's a big.
Absolutely.
It's a very.
And you're a regional
we're very dependent on that sector, and in another city it might be very different.
Correct.
But in Bangalore, it is very IT dependent.
But do you think the city is also expanding its city limits because of rapid urbanization?
Oh, absolutely. I've been born and brought up in Bangalore. I've been seeing the city for the last maybe 35 odd years, and I think the growth has just been mind-boggling. I think. Nobody would have imagined that the city would expand the way it has, and today we're seeing a lot of developments coming up in towards the peripheral areas. Because I think
and yours as well.
Ours as well. I think the reason is that the infrastructure around the peripheral areas is far better than in the city center.
And your focus is more commercial or real estate in those areas?
Mostly residential. And so the city, I think, is really sort of growing by leaps and bounds, and I think all of us are sort of just riding the wave along with that.
Now, we all know that the real estate sector is known to face a lot of regulatory hiccups as well. What are your plans around it? How do you end up tackling this regulatory framework in our country, which is very unfavorable for the proper functioning of real estate sector?
There really is no regulatory framework that exists currently, and I think that is there has been talk of a real estate regulator or a bill that is being currently proposed. I'm not so sure about the intent of the having a regulator, or the bill may be right. I'm not so certain that the objective of having this regulator is going to help. If anything, I think it's just going to increase costs, which eventually get passed on to the end consumer because the developer is not going to absorb those costs. Second, I think the projects are going to get delayed beyond what it is already getting delayed.
Despite having a regulatory framework, proper one in place.
I think it's just going to be another approval or another window that we need to sort of go to, in addition to maybe already the 10 or 12 approvals that we already need to get.
So it's another obstacle more than anything else.
I would think so, but like I said, the intent is good, that they want to protect consumers. And having said that, I think the real estate sector is also to blame, because there have been a lot of players who've been fly by night, who have sort of promised the world and not delivered. Lacked credibility. There have been undue delays in projects, and even some of the reputed people. I think that's really the nature of the beast, and I think the objective should be that all the stakeholders, the government, the developers, the consumers need to come together to put together, a sort of a framework which sort of addresses this, the main concerns.
So what is your solution in your opinion?
I think one is that the approval process needs to be made far easier and quicker. I mean, people often tend to blame the developer for delays of projects, but many a times, believe me, that these are not something that the developer can also is in control of.
I agree with you.
So I think you have to look at this whole sector more holistically and see how do we sort of address these issues which
So
are more.
developers like you coming together to sort of put a framework in place and of course appeal to the government to do something about it?
What was really missing is the interface of the academia. Where really, because today what happens is that developers don't have time to do research. Be it faster construction technologies, be it process improvements. For anything, today we just follow practices which have been sort of there because nobody has time to really innovate or invent.
True.
And that's where we felt as a company that the academia piece was missing, which is why we sort of we've created a real estate research initiative together with IIM Bangalore, which we sort of instituted last year.
Being an alumni, it must have.
Yeah, I
been
think
fairly
it was one way, for me to sort of reconnect with my campus. But more importantly, I thought the sector really needed something like this very, very desperately.
Interesting.
Where research happens, we're able to go to the policymakers with numbers, with facts, and with statistics. Because
True.
when a developer goes, he's viewed very differently from when an academia goes and presents something.
Absolutely understand.
So that's an initiative that we've done, and which we're hoping will sort of take off well, and eventually become maybe a center for real estate, really a port of call in India for anybody wanting to do real estate.
Now, some trend-setting opportunities in the real estate space, real estate funds being one of them. Is that a trend that we're latching on to?
I think funds have been there for a while now. I think,
But they've not really picked up as much as they needed to.
because
Would
it's
you
not been
agree?
successful, right?
That's exactly.
I think the whole everybody's
it
gone
take?
through a learning. I
Yeah.
think it was new for everybody, and I think today everybody's a lot smarter. We've seen a time when there were, just like there were innumerable developers, there were innumerable number of funds. But today, I think they have come down to a handful. People with good pedigree, people who understand the sector deep enough now. And I'm sure that over time we will start seeing some of these people who've really sort of done well over time, and then that will sort of attract more money and more talent, as well as more funds to sort of come and participate in the sector.
Well, walking the talk and of course walking the fairway with me is the Managing Director of Century Real Estate, Ravindra Pai, with me. On the other side of this break, we will continue our conversation. Take a quick break right here on Tea Time. Welcome back on Tea Time. We're in the process of finishing our game and of course our talk as well with Ravi. Now Ravi, are we seeing good pre-sales? What is the execution looking like and how's the quarter looking like?
Like I said, I think 2013 has started well. Not just for us. I think overall the industry, I think the numbers are good. It has been on the upswing, maybe for the last 2 quarters or so. Residential sales, I think, are doing extremely well. There's good demand. Like I said, the key is really to get the right pricing and the right ticket size. Earlier we were all very focused on the per square foot price.
Right.
But I think it's now boiling down to really what is the ticket size. Because that reflects directly onto the affordability of the unit, for the customers. But that has become the new sort of driver.
And you spoke about demand for residential sector some time ago. Now, what about the commercial sector? What is the demand looking like in a city like Bangalore for commercial real estate?
Well, we don't have too much of an exposure to commercial real estate, but from the reports that I read, the offtake has been fairly decent. I believe Bangalore is in about 11 million square feet this year, as against maybe 10 million last year. Yeah. So I think offtake is fairly good, but a friend of mine was just telling me. I look at friends who are running other businesses.
Right.
I think people are still very cautious about expanding and growth. So that reflects directly in sort of a lot of office space available and empty in the city center. And rentals really not keeping pace. True. So today there are projects where residential prices are at, let's say, 20,000 rupees a square foot, and rentals are at 80 rupees. So if I capitalize that, is at 10,000 rupees.
Right.
So there is really no incentive for anybody to build commercial space.
Interesting.
But having said that, like I mentioned, Bangalore is very IT dependent. I think as and when the IT sector starts looking up, the commercial offtake will keep pace.
Now, on the competition from on the local front as well, you are seeing a lot of Bangalore-based companies. Of course, one of them being where we're standing here,
Right.
Prestige Golfshire, Prestige Construction as well. You've got the likes of many like that in Bangalore.
Right.
What is that one thing that differentiates Century Real Estate from other Bangalore-based developers?
Yeah, so interestingly, many of the developers are partners in many projects. Like
Yeah.
I mentioned, we've done a lot of joint developments with all the reputed developers. So really, from our perspective, I think we're in a unique position that we really don't foresee them as competitors, but almost like partners.
Lovely.
And we share a great relationship and rapport with many of them. But coming to the differentiation that we as a company hold is really, I think, 2 or 3. One is the quality of the land bank. Like I mentioned, The second real differentiator, I think, is really just the location of our land parcels. You know, I just talked about, all of them abutting at the state highways, national highways. So it's not just the size of the land bank, but I think it's the quality that's also important. Thirdly, I personally believe that, since we were late entrants into the development space, not necessarily the real estate, but the development space, we had the benefit of, sort of really molding this company into a professional outfit, which, most of other competitors had some baggage from, the pre-2005 or pre-2006 era. Whereas we've built a company which is completely process-driven, system-driven, and we empower our employees. So that means there's a lot of innovation that happens. People come up with great ideas. We encourage that. So I think these are the differentiations that we really bring to the market as compared to competitors.
Nice roll. Just missed it by a whisker though, like everything else in life. You find putting easy, you find putting difficult?
I think putting is a lot harder, because like I said, the margin of error is so little.
Yeah.
Whereas on a drive, you can always sort of 5 feet here or there, it doesn't matter. But here, even an inch.
This is your precision point testing
so I
you
think
to the
I find this the hardest.
What is the next thing that you're planning to do in the sports arena?
One of the things that maybe I didn't mention is that I'm a very avid squash player. So I played competitive. I mean, I played billiards, cricket, snooker, and badminton at a competitive level. But squash is something has been, it's been very close to my heart. And it's not a very popular sport. Similar to golf. I mean, accessibility to the sport has been not that easy. There are not many people who take up the sport. So that is something that maybe I would like to take up to sort of expose that
you'd like
sport
to promote a lot more squash tournaments, maybe.
Yeah. So we recently sponsored. There was a tournament that was held recently where the India's top six top ranked people came and had exhibition sort of a match, which we sort of supported. So there's a Masters tournament that's likely to be held very soon, and so personally I'm very sort of keen that I'm able to support squash in a good way. Of course, we will do our bit for all the other sports that we have been doing.
Right.
But I think squash remains my personal passion.
So from squash to golf to horse racing to wrestling and still counting, all the very best with all the initiatives.
Thank you so much, Chaiti. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for being on the show with us. That was Ravi, who is the Managing Director of Century Real Estate. I will see you next week again. Until then, may the sport be with you.